Well, how are we doing today? Good. Nice small group. Well, it's good to see you. Thanks for coming in. Maybe some folks will join. A couple of things. So I'm going to talk about closing argument. About a month ago, my team and I, we were very fortunate to get a $363 million verdict, most of it punitive damages. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the case, obviously, so you can have a little context as I go through some of what I did during closing argument. But you know, obviously, as I go through this stuff, certain things might be different based on your jurisdiction. Feel free to ask questions, raise your hand. We can make this interactive. But one thing is, you know, other than legal questions that might be different relative to jurisdictions, one thing that I learned, I've never asked for that amount of money from a jury. I hadn't handled a case as first chair that had this level of media coverage, that had a packed courtroom. So that was different. But despite all of those differences between this case and other cases that I learned is that the nuts and bolts, the stuff that we're learning here, that we're talking about, cross-examination, voir dire, etc., it's all the same. It's all the same. You're standing there in front of those 12 people, you clear the mechanism, you block all the rest of it out, it's all the same. It might be a little more complex, there might be a little bit more of it, but it's all the same stuff that I applied in this case, that I've applied in other cases, and it worked out really well. So just a few case facts. Let's go through the case so you get some context as I go through some of the things that I did in closing argument. So what this case was about is back in 1985, a medical device sterilization company set up shop in a small town outside of Chicago known as Willowbrook, Illinois. And what they used in order to sterilize those medical devices is this chemical called ethylene oxide. Now, ethylene oxide, going all the way back to 1985 and even before 1985, was known to be toxic. It was known to be mutagenic. Mutagenic, that just means that it's capable of mutating DNA. And in fact, that's what makes it such an effective sterilizer. That's what it does. It's a sterilant. It kills things. The way it does it is it gets inside the cells and disables the DNA. It's a mutagen. And so it's always been known, or in terms of, maybe not always, but as far back as is relevant, to have been a mutagen, toxic, and for a long time it was a suspected carcinogen that eventually evolved into being determined to be a known carcinogen. And so what we have is these entities, the EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, NTP, the National Toxicology Program, IARC, the International Association for Research on Cancer, which is an arm of the World Health Organization, and OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, have all classified it in some form or another over the years. It used to be a suspected carcinogen, now it's a known carcinogen. So that's the chemical that they were dealing with, an insidious chemical. From 1985 to 1999, it was owned by Griffith. That's one of the parent companies that was a defendant. And in 2004, it's been owned by a publicly traded company, Sotera Health. And my client was a 55-year-old woman, at least she was 55 in 2007, she's now 71, who was diagnosed with breast cancer. She lived about a third of a mile away from the plant. And so we had air dispersion modeling, we had emissions figures in terms of the amount of ethylene oxide that left the facility and made its way to her home and other places in the community where she would have breathed it in. And we were able to show the jury what she was exposed to in terms of the amount of ethylene oxide, the carcinogen. Our theory, in essence, was that they emitted too much, unnecessary and excessive amounts. Why? Because they didn't use the available pollution controls. Pollution controls in this industry, they're very large, they're very expensive. It requires significant construction to put them in. It's not the most convenient thing to do. You might have to shut down the facility in order to do it, and that takes away from revenue. And so they did not put in the necessary and available pollution controls starting in the beginning and over the years. In addition to that, One thing that I thought was very powerful, they never warned. So they never warned the plaintiff or anybody in the general public as to what they were doing. There were little hints out in the ethos that maybe people could have figured out, but in terms of actually directly warning people, telling them, hey, we're emitting a carcinogen, they never did it. That was an important aspect of our case. They never conducted any ambient air monitoring or air modeling throughout their time in existence in this community. That was another criticism. They essentially did see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. They didn't exactly know what they had going on in the community in terms of the emissions. The parent companies we sued on a direct participation theory, essentially that they were directly participating in their subsidiaries' operation of this facility. And then Griffith, the initial parent company, they opened it up, so we said they never should have put it in a residential area and that they should have had pollution controls from the beginning, which they did not have, and essentially that the building was not fit for this purpose. It allowed what are called fugitive emissions. Those are emissions that just escape through the little nooks and crannies in the building, and this was like an old warehouse. It wasn't really an airtight facility building where it was good for something like this, and we'll talk a little bit about address that in closing. That's the case in a nutshell. I hope that gives you a little bit of an overview. I mean, the long story short is they put out a bad gas, woman breathed it in, she got cancer, it's their fault, and they were reckless in doing that. That's the basics of it. Now, when I think about closing, when I think about any aspect of a trial, because we frequently have, breakout rooms on direct examination or cross-examination or opening or voir dire. And that's important. We got to study these things in terms of the skills that are required to do them. But they're all connected, aren't they? You can't look at any of those in a vacuum. There's connective tissue with everything that you do. And so in terms of specifically voir dire, something that I like to do is after voir dire is over, I go back, I read the transcripts, and I will literally pull out quotes that I am going to read back to the jurors, look them directly in the eye, the juror that said it, read it back to them in order to make that connection, remind them of what they said in voir dire. So from voir dire all the way through closing, we have to be thinking about how we're going to connect all of the dots. Another thing I do as it relates to damages in voir dire, I always, assuming the judge allows, because not every judge allows this, and in Illinois it's discretionary, most judges that I encounter allow it, is put out a number in voir dire. So the proper way to ask it in Illinois is if the law and the evidence supports a verdict in excess of, in this case I said $20 million, in such a verdict. Some people say yes, some people might hem and haw a little bit, but say, yeah, well, if you prove it. Other people might disqualify themselves by saying, it's too much money. Doesn't matter what the evidence is. I could never sign that verdict. You might get them off for cause if you're a little lucky with your judge. I ask that in voir dire, and then that is something that I remind them of in closing arguments. So there's that connective tissue. And then also, a little later, this is the actual flip chart that I had during the case. This chicken scratch here is one of my partners. Don't worry about that, but you can see my flip charts very well organized with numbers on the side, and we'll take a look at that. What I love to do, what I absolutely love to do during the course of a case, particularly if it's of any length, because if it's of any length, you go a couple of weeks in the plaintiff's case, you got a couple of weeks in the defense case, and now you're closing, and your last witness was 3 weeks ago. And all you've done since then is cross-examine defense experts. One of the concerns I always have is, are they going to remember what we said? Are they going to remember what my expert said? And so what I do a lot of in terms of when you're adversely examining maybe one of the defendant's witnesses, what you can do is create that flip chart, have a living, breathing document in front of the jury that you can then use in closing. Again, you're trying to establish this connection with the jury in some way so that you can then, in closing argument, if it's remind them what they said in voir dire or something that they experienced during the trial, they saw you writing it down, you remind them of it, and they remember it better, because memory is, of course, very important as they go to deliberate. And just in terms of voir dire, throughout the examinations, as best you can, because things change during trial, and any closing argument you might write before trial starts is going to look a little or maybe a lot different by the time you give it, depending on what happens. case. And so you want to get those themes out as much as you can. Don't rely on closing to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. It's not going to happen. So what you want to do is make sure that those important themes that you want them to be thinking about when they go to deliberate, that they're, look at this. Isn't that fabulous? Thank you so much, Jared. What a good man. Oof. Cheers. All right. Try not to spill. So, another thing in terms of the evidence, two things that I say to any of my associates, what I was saying to my team here. In this case, always be closing. So the way you ask your questions and direct and cross, always be closing. You want to ask that question like you're given that closing argument, if you can. It doesn't work every single question, but you know what I mean. You want to get out your closing, and then shots. Don't mess around with things that are if it's something that's a little shaky, my opinion is don't even ask it. I like kill shots and kill shots only when we're getting after witnesses. And then when you get to closing argument, you've filtered all that great evidence, only put forward great evidence, and not wasted time on stuff that isn't going to be important for closing argument. All right, so what is closing argument, right? What is it? Because like I said, you're not going to win your case in closing argument. Have a major influence on what that verdict is, right? And so I think of it, number one, as a way to really tell the story. It's the grand finale. It's what everybody's waiting for. It's the thing that we probably talk about and think about the most. Argument. The most important part of the trial is kind of how we think about that. And it's your last chance to tell, or as I put up here, retell your story. It's as if it's the end of the movie and you're trying to bring everything together. Hopefully your case wasn't like Pulp Fiction where it got chopped up and you had to do things in an order that you didn't like for whatever reason, witness availability. But in terms of having the scenes of your movie throughout the trial with the witnesses, you get to closing argument, that's your crescendo, right? That's when you bring it all together. That's when the hero prevails. And that's when you motivate a big verdict. We're going to get to motivation in a second. Another thing, you've got different jurors sitting there. I think of them in three buckets. You've got plaintiff's jurors. Those are going to be the folks you need to arm. You need to give them the ammunition so that when they are deliberating with other jurors that don't feel as strongly about your case as they do, that they can convince those other jurors that they're right and those defense jurors are wrong. You've got fence sitters that perhaps literally show up at closing argument. They're not sure which way they're going to go. Well, you got to win them over, right? You got to win them over. You got to win closing argument so you win those folks over. And then you've got the defense jurors. And the way I like to think about it, and the way I think about it from jury selection all the way through, is those folks that you were worried might be defense jurors, you want to depress them, right? You want them to not be fired up. You don't want them going in fired up, ready to save the doctor from this not meritorious lawsuit. They're gonna fight for that not guilty. You don't want that, right? You want to depress those defense jurors so they don't have a fire in their belly to either bring back an NG or bring down your damages, right? I do think, in terms of winning and losing, I don't think a lot gets done in closing argument. I think what I just said is about the extent of it, but I think closing argument does have a damages. You can't have a profound effect on damages. And then you want to motivate all of them, particularly in a case like this where we had punitive damages available. You want to motivate them to get excited and end the verdict with a capital V. And then finally, you got to salivate over rebuttal. They don't get the same courage. You want to save stuff for rebuttal and make sure that you got something really good to finish with, and we're going to get into that. All right, so let's start at the beginning, storytelling. First of all, really what you say during closing argument is only as good as your credibility. And I always talk about trials as credibility and impressions. So what's your credibility? What's the credibility of your plaintiff? What's the credibility of your experts? And certainly your credibility is always on the line. And hopefully by the time you get to closing argument, you've built up your credibility at a very high level, torn down the credibility of the defense witnesses, and then it's the impressions you leave. Particularly in a case like this, about a 5 to 6 week trial, and even in shorter trials, They're not going to remember every single word. They're not going to have a transcript back in deliberations. But what's the impression that you left? One of the reasons I talk about kill shots when I talk about cross-examinations is if you are literally just bludgeoning that witness with all your best stuff, and the stuff that's a little wobbly, maybe not as great, maybe not as tight in the deposition, maybe the evidence isn't perfect for this issue, but they talked about it on direct. That doesn't mean you have to cover it. Just do kill shots, bludgeon that witness so that the impression is, that witness is full of it. I can't believe that witness. And that's what they carry through, that feeling they have when you're done cross-examining them, and that's going to benefit you in closing argument. And then, in terms of during closing argument, leaving them with those important impressions that you're right and they're wrong. Now, a big aspect of that, and talk about this in a second, but what I call blunt system one statements or phrases or sentences. What's system one? I'm going to get to it in a bit, but system one is differentiated from system two. There's this book by Daniel Kahneman. It's called Thinking Fast and Slow, and it talks about this, and I'm going to come back to it in a moment. And then make it real. One of the powers we have as human beings, and what exists in every juror's brain, for any juror that's ever sat for any one of your cases, is the unbelievable ability, and we did a little bit of this in I've got some folks from our workshop this morning, and we did a little bit of it, and I'll just do the same thing again now, is an unbelievable ability to create a picture in one's mind with your words. And so what we talked about this morning, I said, picture Tom Hanks sitting on an elephant with a Yankees hat and a machete in his hand. Everyone in this room just did that. Everyone in this room can see it. Yours might be a little different than hers, might be a little different than his, but we all just did that. Do that in trial. Do that powerfully and persuasively during closing arguments. So credibility and impressions, how do you build that up? How do you make sure that you maintain it during closing argument so that they know that you're the broker of truth? You're the one with the lantern, right? Come on, jury, follow me. I got you. I'm going to show you the way. And so indisputable truths. What does that mean? Well, when I talk about indisputable truths, I mean acknowledging things that you must acknowledge. I'll give you an example. We had a defense witness who was a breast cancer, a breast surgeon for women with breast cancer. She was a lovely lady, very well credentialed, great educational background, been doing it for decades, but she's not a cancer biologist. She's not a toxicologist. She doesn't have that background, and they tried to bring her in and talk about causation. It just was like fitting a square peg in a round hole, because she's a surgeon. She doesn't research that stuff. And so she cited a couple of studies and said, I don't think ethylene oxide caused her cancer, and they liked the fact that she was a well-credentialed breast surgeon. And so, indisputable truth. I don't need to make her out to be a villain. I don't need to talk about her like she's some evil person. So I just kind of touched it. You just talk about it totally truthfully, authentically. You're like, look, nice lady, very well credentialed, but she's not a cancer biologist. And you just talk about it in plain terms, indisputable truths. Ethylene oxide serves a very important purpose. It sterilizes medical equipment. It absolutely is something that's necessary. We all like sterilized medical equipment. Nobody wants to get an infection. That's not what this case is about. And now what you've done is you've taken away, you've de-weaponized something that the other side is trying to weaponize. Like in these cases, one thing they want to talk about is ethylene oxide it's so important and we do such good work. We're saving lives across the globe. If I heard that once, I heard it 100 times during this case. And so you want to de-weaponize that. Yeah, we agree with that. That's fine. That's not what this is about. You can do that without giving people cancer. And so you want to have those indisputable truths. And then making connections. I think that in any way that you can make connections with jurors, I talked a little bit about repeating back to them in voir dire, something that they've said. And just otherwise figuring out ways that you're going to connect with the jury. Making good eye contact, doing those things where the jury's looking at you like this guy or gal is credible, I believe him or her, and I'm going to follow the way. Because that's the attitude you want. And then analogies. You want to think through analogies. You don't want to do analogies on the fly. You want to think about how they might be used against you. If you have a shaky analogy, I'd save it for rebuttal, because then they can't use it against you. But think of good analogies, because I think analogies really can drive home the point. We're going to talk about a couple that I used. And so this was the example I gave. I really like this one. So this was during jury selection. I asked this juror, does anybody have a philosophical bend against lawsuits? Anybody? And we had already had a little discussion going. And so this particular panel was talkative. And this fella gave a great answer. Phenomenal. I forget why he even got on the jury. He was an alternate. He ended up getting on because we lost somebody over the course of the 5-6 week trial, which was great. We were excited that this guy got on, in large part because here's what he said during jury selection. I'm going to have to disagree with other juror. I think that as far as monetary value, you have to weigh in the defendant how much money is involved and what they're making, because you got to hold them accountable if found guilty. Because in this case, if that's what they did, I feel like we got to pick a number that's significant enough to where this doesn't happen again if they're found complicit in this case. Hey, I don't know how he snuck on, but I'm glad he did. And so in closing, right here, and there was some discussion during jury selection that depends, maybe they need to be punished, and it depends, where are you going to have an impact? And I looked him right in the eye, I said that, and he gave me one of these, like, yeah, I did say that. And so just trying to make that connection. Now, speaking of analogies, this is a good one, I really like it. And it can be used, I think, in any case. Griffith, I told you, the initial parent company, they opened the facility. There was this thing called the deox scrubber. That's a fancy term for pollution control, and it would have reduced the amount of ethylene oxide that went into the community by 95+%. It would have dramatically reduced the amount that my client would have breathed, at least for the first few years when they didn't have it. And they acted like, yeah, but it was emerging technology, and it was okay to wait, and not all the companies were using it. But what we had was evidence that in 1982, there was a presentation from a trade group where the pollution control manufacturer came in and showed them that, hey, this is a great piece of equipment you could use. And then in 1983, there was a letter from the New York State, their equivalent to the EPA, where it said it's the best available control technology. And then there was a newsletter in Discovery that we had from 1984, where additional pollution control measures were identified. And so you had these three warnings. These three warnings where it was like, look, you have the pollution control available to you. Why didn't you just buy it and install it and put it in? Why did you allow so much ethylene oxide to go into the community? And the analogy that I did, and I'll do it right now because I think it's a good one, and the rule of three, it just kind of touches all the bases. So it's especially good in like those rural areas where religion is a very serious part of the fabric of that society. So here's how it goes. There was a flood coming to a town. The three warnings Griffith got reminds me of a story about a flood that was coming to a town. There was a man that lived in that town, and he was a very religious man, a God-fearing Christian. And as the flood was coming, the water was starting to build. One of his neighbors drove by in a car and said, you know, we really need to evacuate the town. You ought to come with me. And he said, no, I'll be fine. I believe in God. God will save me. I think I'll be safe. He says, okay, fine. He drives away. The water gets higher. Now there's no cars driving because it's too much water. A boat comes by. Boat comes by. The person operating the boat says, sir, the rain is only getting worse. The flood's only going to get worse. The water's going to keep getting higher. You got to come with me on the boat. No. I believe in God. I'm a God-fearing man. God will save me. All right. Drives away. Now, it's so nasty. The best they can do to get into the air is a helicopter comes by. They drop down a ladder. Climb up. You're going to drown. He says, no. I'll be fine. God will save me. And of course, what happened? He drowned. And so he shows up at the pearly gates, and there he is, and he's confronted by God. And he says, God, I believed in you. I followed you my whole life. Why didn't you save me? And God says, what are you talking about? I sent you a car, a boat, and a helicopter. And so I think that story resonates. It's like, yeah, what were they doing? They knew about the pollution control. They didn't do anything. And so that's a little, and there's the transcript, and I think I told it a little quicker during the trial, but That's proof that I actually did tell that story. There it is. And then another thing I did in terms of analogies in this particular case is one thing that they were saying is that, hey, look, those regulatory limits in terms of the appropriate level of ethylene oxide in the air, those are just protective, what the EPA says. The amounts that they say increase the risk, those are just health protective. They're precautionary. They don't actually represent what's going to cause cancer because they build in layers and layers of redundancy so that it's never even close to dangerous. So even if we were allowing the levels in the environment to be a little bit above that, no big deal. And so what we pointed out is that they weren't just a little bit above that. They blew way past it. So they didn't like the fact that the environment are supposed to be kept at a certain level, and we were able to prove that the levels in this particular community were much higher. And so the analogy was basically this. Yeah, if you're going 50 miles per hour, or if you're in a school zone, you're 20 miles per hour, and you're going 22 or 24, you know, depending on the circumstances, that may or may not be dangerous. Are there kids like right there in the playground? Who knows? 22, 24, that's still pretty slow, even though you're breaking the law. So it depends on the circumstances. But let's say you're driving down the highway. Yeah, sure, 55 is precautionary. It's not like you're a bat out of hell at 57. But what if you're going 500? And that drives the point home, that they can try to divorce themselves from the EPA limits, but that doesn't really count. They're blowing past it by so much. And so I thought that was an effective analogy as well. All right, so then that other point that we talked about in terms of making it real. So the defendants had superior knowledge. One of the pieces of evidence that we had was in the late 90s, the company, that initial company, Griffith, they were going to be going public. And so what they had to do in order to go public is they did a disclosure to the SEC. And when these companies do disclosures to the SEC before they're going public, they got to disclose the risks that are associated with the company, like the liability. And so one thing that they disclosed was, you know, we operate with ethylene oxide, it's a carcinogen, and people in the community, if they find out about it, essentially, this is how it read, there could be protests, there could be regulatory scrutiny. And so essentially, and we did this in the depositions and it came home in closing, we talked about how they're warning Wall Street, they're warning the investment community, but they're not warning the people that are actually being exposed to the carcinogen. And so we see that here, just a little snippet. I said this is against the backdrop of messing with the NIOSH study, so we had some evidence that they were playing games with some of the information that they were providing to the research arm of OSHA as OSHA was gathering data as to whether or not this chemical can cause cancer. They're trying to influence the breast cancer study, that's kind of along the same lines, providing information to the investigators to their advantage. And here's what they're telling the investors, and I had the exhibit up. At the same time, while Sue Kamuta in 1998, because that's when the disclosure was made, she's 47 years old, she has 3 kids, she's just starting to have grandkids, and has no clue. And so I want them juxtaposing the fact that here's this document warning Wall Street, hey guys, just so you know, there is this potential liability issue, but don't worry, you know, a lot of revenue here, invest in us. And then on the other side of the coin, you've got people in the community with their children out in the park breathing ethylene oxide completely unbeknownst to them. And now you're trying to create that picture that there's, you know, some fat cat on Wall Street getting the warning, and then poor Sue Kamuta and her kids and grandkids not getting the warning. So you want to try to make that real. Breathing a carcinogen. And we had a very effective animation literally showing ethylene oxide molecules going into the body, into the lungs, into the cells, breaking DNA strands, mutating DNA, causing deletions and translocations of chromosomes, doing its dirty work on the human body. And so we wanted to make that real as well. This is the insidiousness of this chemical ethylene oxide. Because that was very important, because everything flows, in all of our cases, from foreseeable harm. Everything flows from foreseeable harm in our cases.